Woman dies and learns Earth's future. Her warning is terrifying. NDE. Marie had never imagined her life would end so suddenly. She was in the prime of her life, 42, successful, surrounded by family, and yet, in the blink of an eye, it all disappeared. It was a car accident, a split second of distraction, a sharp swerve on a rain-slicked road, and then, darkness. When she awoke, there was no pain, no sensation of injury. There was only a sense of weightlessness, an odd feeling as though she was floating. Her eyes opened to a light so pure it seemed to shimmer with the very essence of existence. It wasn't the blinding white light she had heard about from others who had experienced near-death. This light was different. It felt warm, comforting, yet unsettling in its unfamiliarity. She tried to move, but her body didn't respond. She was weightless, suspended in space. There were no walls, no ceiling, only this light and the endless abyss that surrounded her. She could not hear anything, not even her own breath. It was as if the world she had known had ceased to exist. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to understand what had happened. When she opened them again, she saw the figure standing before her, a man, tall and radiant, but with an aura of profound sadness that filled the space. "Marie," the man said, his voice gentle, but heavy. "It is time for you to know the truth." Her heart raced in her chest. She had heard the stories, the whispers of people who had crossed over and seen glimpses of the afterlife, but she never thought it would happen to her. I don't understand," Marie whispered, her voice trembling. "Am I dead?" The figure nodded slowly, the sadness in his eyes deepening. "Yes. Your time on Earth is finished." Marie tried to speak, but no words came. The reality of what he was saying was too much to grasp. Her body, her life, had just ended, and yet here she was, standing in a place that defied all logic. The world she had known seemed so distant now, so irrelevant. She had lived in a world of noise, of constant distractions, of days spent in routine. But now, in this strange place, all of that seemed so meaningless. "Where am I?" she asked, the words barely a whisper, unsure if she even had the strength to speak. "You are between," the figure said, "between life and what comes after. You are in a space where time does not exist, and where knowledge is laid bare." Marie felt a shiver run through her. She had heard stories of the afterlife, but nothing like this. No one had ever described a place like this. It wasn't heaven, it wasn't hell, it was something else entirely, something beyond her comprehension. The figure seemed to sense her confusion. He stepped forward, closer to her, and his presence became even more powerful. She felt it in the air around her, a pulse, as though something vast and ancient was being drawn toward her, like the universe itself was leaning in to listen. "There is something you need to see, Marie," the figure said. "Something that is coming. The truth about the world you once knew is far darker than you can imagine." Marie's heart skipped a beat. The figure's words carried weight, each one like a stone sinking into the depths of her mind. She had seen glimpses of the future in her own life, quick moments, flashes, and feelings that made her wonder about the path humanity was on. But now, standing before this figure in a realm beyond death, she was about to understand the truth in a way that would shatter everything she thought she knew. "Is it about the world? About humanity?" she asked, the question feeling strange on her tongue, but it was all she could think of. "Yes," the figure replied, his voice darkening. "What you are about to see will reveal the truth of Earth's future. It is not a future of hope. It is a future of despair." Marie felt her heart tighten in her chest. The feeling of dread washed over her like a wave, and for a moment, she wondered if she had made some mistake, some wrong turn in her life that had brought her here to face this moment. But there was no time to ask. The figure raised his hand, and the air around them shifted. Suddenly, the world around Marie changed. It wasn't the ethereal, weightless place she had been floating in. It was the earth she had known, but it was different, distorted, broken. She gasped as the scene before her unfolded. The sky was dark, shrouded in thick, swirling clouds that blocked out the sun. The land was barren, cracked, and desolate. Cities that had once been teeming with life lay in ruins, their skeletons jutting up from the earth like the remains of some ancient civilization. There were no people here, only echoes of their absence. What happened? Marie whispered, her voice trembling. The figure remained silent for a moment, his gaze heavy as he watched her take in the destruction. Then he spoke, his words like ice in the air. This is what will become of the earth, Marie. Humanity has turned away from the truth. It has turned away from the path of balance. And because of that, the world is dying. Marie couldn't breathe. The sight before her was too much to process, too overwhelming. She had seen things like this in movies, in books, but this was different. This was real. This was her world, the world she had known, crumbling before her eyes. Is there no hope? She managed to ask, her voice barely audible. The figure shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with an ancient sorrow that made Marie's heart ache. There is little hope left, he said. Humanity has ignored the signs for too long. The damage is irreversible. But there is still a choice. A final chance to change things, but it will come at a cost. Marie's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. A final chance? What did that mean? Could the earth really be saved? And if so, who would be the one to save it? And at what cost? Before she could ask another question, the figure raised his hand again, and the vision before her shifted. The destruction of the earth faded, replaced by images of people. People fighting, rioting, consuming, and destroying. It wasn't just the land that was suffering. Humanity itself was unraveling. Is this the end? Marie whispered, her voice breaking. No, the figure said, his voice hardening, but it is the beginning of the end. And it is up to you, Marie, to carry this knowledge back to Earth. You will bear the weight of this prophecy, and you will bring it to the world. What happens next depends on the choices of those who are still alive. But humanity will have to change. And quickly. Before it's too late. The weight of the words sank into Marie's chest like a stone, and her heart began to race. She could feel the enormity of the task that had been thrust upon her. How could she carry such knowledge? How could she make the world understand what was coming? You must warn them, the figure said, before the final darkness descends. And just like that, the vision began to fade. The figure, the words, the terrifying future, all of it began to dissolve into the void. Marie's world spun, and she felt herself being pulled, torn away from the figure, from the horrifying truth she had just seen. But she couldn't escape it. She couldn't unsee it. And as the light around her grew brighter, she realized that her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Marie's mind reeled as the light surrounding her began to dim, pulling her away from the figure who had shown her the future. She could still feel the weight of his words pressing against her chest like a boulder. The world she had known was unraveling before her eyes, and she was supposed to be the one to carry that knowledge back. But how could she? How could she possibly bear such a burden? How could she be the one to change a future so bleak? She felt herself being pulled back, dragged through a void that didn't feel like the afterlife she had expected. There was no warmth, no peace. Instead, there was only cold emptiness, a vast, endless stretch of nothingness. Her heart pounded in her chest, but the sensation felt distant, as if it were happening to someone else. The air felt thick, as though it was closing in on her. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. Marie's vision cleared, and she found herself standing once again in the sterile, white space she had encountered when she first arrived here. But this time, it wasn't the peace she had felt before. There was a sharpness to the air, an unsettling stillness that sent a chill down her spine. The figure stood before her again, but this time, there was no light surrounding him. His form was sharper, more defined. His eyes, which had once carried a comforting sadness, were now colder, harder. The sadness remained, but it was tinged with something else, something darker. "You've seen it now," the figure said, his voice less gentle than before. "The truth about Earth's future." Marie felt her knees tremble, the weight of his words sinking deeper into her chest. "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "I can't carry this knowledge. It's too much. It's too overwhelming." The figure's eyes narrowed, but there was no judgment in them, only a profound understanding. "It is the burden you must bear. he said softly, stepping closer. You will not be alone in this. Others will hear the call. Others will see, but you must be the one to warn them. Marie wanted to scream, to deny the truth, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't ignore what she had seen. The destruction, the chaos. The people she had known, now mere shadows in the wreckage of civilization. Humanity had gone down a path of greed and neglect, and the figure had shown her the cost. I don't know how to make them listen, she said, her voice quivering. They won't believe me. No one will believe me. They will believe, the figure replied, his tone firm. They will believe when the signs become undeniable. When the darkness begins to spread, and the world trembles in its wake. But how do I stop it? Marie asked desperately. What can I do? The figure looked at her with something akin to pity. You cannot stop it alone. You cannot change the course of the entire world on your own. But you can be the spark. You can plant the seed of truth that will grow into the change the world needs. Marie closed her eyes, trying to make sense of it all. The weight of her responsibility was suffocating, and yet there was no escape. The world was falling apart, and she was the one who had been chosen to carry the message. You were chosen not because of your strength, but because of your heart, the figure continued. You are a witness, yes, but you are also a beacon. You will spread the word, and others will follow. The world will listen when it is ready. But you must carry that truth with you. Will it be enough? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Will the world change? Can it be saved? The figure's gaze grew distant, as if he were seeing beyond the present, beyond the questions that Marie had asked. For a moment, there was a deep silence between them, and Marie felt the immense weight of her own existence. She had always been a part of the world, one of the billions who lived in it, who followed the daily routine, who never thought much about the future. But now, that future had been laid bare before her, and she could not unsee it. The world has already begun its descent, the figure said, his voice low and filled with sorrow. But every descent has a bottom. And sometimes, even from the deepest darkness, there is light. Marie's chest tightened as she tried to process what he was saying. The figure was telling her that change was still possible, but it was not going to be easy. Humanity had chosen its path, and now, the cost of those choices was becoming too great to ignore. Could she truly be the one to lead them away from the precipice? You must trust in the seed you plant, the figure urged, his eyes softening. You are not alone in this. There are others, like you, who will rise when the time comes. You will not fight alone. Marie's mind whirled with the enormity of what she was being asked to do. The weight of the prophecy, the weight of the responsibility, seemed to crush her. How could she possibly be the one to carry this truth? To spread the warning? She wasn't powerful, she wasn't a leader. She was just one person in a world full of chaos. But then, something shifted inside her. A small, but undeniable spark. A flicker of determination. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stand by and let the world slip into oblivion. The truth had been given to her, and no matter how overwhelming it was, she couldn't just ignore it. I will do it, Marie said, her voice stronger now, though still trembling. I will carry the truth. I will do whatever I can to warn them. I won't let them fall without a fight. The figure nodded slowly, the faintest trace of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. Then your journey has truly begun. As he spoke, the light around them shifted, and the vast emptiness of the afterlife seemed to grow distant. The coldness of the hospital room, the sterile white walls, began to fade, and Marie felt herself being pulled back to the world she had once known. Her body felt heavier now, as if it had been asleep for far too long. Her mind, once filled with confusion and fear, now buzzed with a strange clarity. Her task was clear now, but as she was drawn back to her physical form, the weight of the truth she had learned seemed more unbearable than ever. There was no going back. The world she had left was slipping away, but the world she was returning to was not the same. Marie's eyes fluttered open, but the world around her seemed impossibly distant. The sterile scent of the hospital room filled her nostrils, the white walls seeming suffocating as they closed in on her. She could hear the faint beeping of machines, the soft murmur of nurses passing outside her door. It felt real enough, too real, too mundane for what she had just witnessed. Her fingers twitched at her sides, and she instinctively reached up to touch her face, confirming that the familiar contours of her own skin were still there. She was alive, there was no question about that. But everything had changed. The world she had returned to was no longer the same one she had known. The visions, the afterlife, the figure who had spoken the prophecy to her, all of it felt too surreal, like some strange dream that had no place in reality. And yet, the truth of it settled in her bones. Her task, her mission, was clear now. But where could she even begin? Marie tried to sit up, but her body felt weak, as if it were still tethered to some other place. The weight of the truth she had seen, the terrible future that awaited humanity, seemed to pull her down, making every movement feel like a battle. The prophecy had left her with an insatiable hunger for knowledge, a need to understand the warning she had been given. The burden of carrying that truth was heavy, but it wasn't the weight of the information that unnerved her. It was the fact that she was alone in this. Alone in a way that went beyond the physical. Alone in the knowledge that the world was heading toward a precipice, and there was no clear path to stop it. Her head spun as she tried to make sense of everything. The afterlife had shown her glimpses of Earth's future, visions of destruction, of humanity caught in the grips of its own demise. But what did that truly mean? How could one person, someone like her, ever be able to alter the course of something so monumental? She had learned that humanity was headed toward collapse, that the very foundation of civilization was fragile, but there was still so much left unanswered. How would it all unfold? What role would she play in it? And perhaps the most important question of all, what exactly was she supposed to do now? The figure had told her that the truth was not just something to witness, it was something to carry. But carrying it felt like a burden too heavy to bear. The future she had seen was inevitable, but she couldn't reconcile the idea that she was powerless to change it. No, that wasn't what the figure had said. The figure had given her a choice, an opportunity to warn the world, to help others see what was coming, and to inspire change. But would that even be enough? She felt the tightness in her chest again as she tried to breathe more deeply, willing the panic that was rising within her to subside. It was difficult to focus. Her thoughts kept scattering in every direction, each one a sharp spike of fear, confusion, and frustration. "Where do I even start?" she murmured aloud, her voice raspy and weak. It was then that she realized how truly isolated she was. There was no one to share this knowledge with. No one who would believe her. She had always been a practical person, someone who believed in the logic of the world, someone who trusted in what could be seen and understood. But now, standing on the precipice of this horrifying prophecy, she realized just how fragile everything was. There was nothing certain anymore, nothing she could hold on to that would make the chaos she had seen make sense. Her fingers curled into the blankets, fists trembling with the tension in her chest. The room around her felt stifling now, almost suffocating, as though the air itself had become too thick to breathe. She felt the desire to escape, to run, but she knew there was nowhere to go. The truth was everywhere, lingering just beyond the walls, heavy in the silence that wrapped around her. "Why can't I just forget?" she whispered. "Why can't I just go back to the way things were?" But that was impossible. It had been impossible from the moment she had seen what lay ahead. No matter how much she wanted to deny it, the knowledge was embedded in her soul, and there was no erasing it. She was the bearer of the truth, and there was no turning back from that. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The door to her room creaked open, and a nurse stepped inside, her face soft with concern. "Marie, how are you feeling?" the nurse asked gently, approaching her bedside. Marie tried to smile, but it felt hollow. "I'm okay," she said, her voice thin and distant. She couldn't bring herself to tell this stranger the truth. How could she? Who would believe her? Even if she tried, how could she explain the weight of the knowledge that had been thrust upon her? How could she describe the future, so bleak and terrible, and make anyone believe that it was real? The nurse hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You've been through something traumatic. The doctors say you're recovering, but if you ever feel overwhelmed..." Marie nodded, her eyes drifting toward the window. She didn't need the nurse's words to tell her that she was overwhelmed. She had felt overwhelmed from the moment she opened her eyes in this hospital room. Overwhelmed by the weight of the truth, by the certainty that the world she knew was on the verge of destruction, and that she was one of the few people who could see it coming. The nurse smiled, but there was an odd, almost knowing look in her eyes. Marie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, as though the nurse wasn't just someone here to help her heal, but someone who understood, someone who could see the unease that was beginning to fester inside of her. "I'll be right outside," the nurse said softly before leaving the room. Marie watched the door close behind her, the silence creeping back into the space. She felt like she was being suffocated by it, by the weight of everything that had happened, by the terrifying reality that the world was headed toward an irreversible fate, and by the knowledge that she had no idea where to start. The uncertainty of the future was worse than any pain she had ever felt. It wasn't the physical injury that haunted her, it was the knowledge of the unseen, the unknown, that filled her every thought. The powerlessness in the face of humanity's impending collapse weighed on her. But as the minutes passed, an idea began to form in her mind. A small, fragile thread of hope, no matter how distant. The figure had said that she was a witness, but it also said that others would rise when the time came. Could she really be the spark? Could she be the one to wake people up before it was too late? The room felt a little less suffocating now, though the uncertainty still hung in the air. But Jack, no, she reminded herself, it was Marie now, couldn't be the only one who had seen the truth. She wasn't alone in this. But who else knew? The question lingered as her thoughts drifted again, uncertain, unsure of what came next, but more determined to find the answers. Marie sat in her hospital bed, staring out the window at the bustling world outside. Life was moving on as it always did, but it felt as though she was no longer part of it. The world, with all its noise and distractions, seemed so distant now, like it belonged to someone else. She could hear the chirps of birds and the distant hum of traffic, but it was as if those sounds were muffled, as though the universe had gone quiet for her, while the weight of what she had seen, the future, the end, pressed down on her chest. Her thoughts spiraled, relentless and chaotic. How could she continue on like this? How could she act like everything was normal when she now knew the fate of the world? She could still see the images in her mind. Visions of destruction, cities reduced to ruins, humanity in chaos. The earth itself seemed to wither, consumed by the very greed and neglect that had defined human existence. She couldn't unsee it. She couldn't forget what the figure had shown her. And no matter how hard she tried to push the images away, they were always there, lurking just beneath the surface of her mind, ready to flood her with terror once again. Marie reached for the glass of water on her bedside table, her hands trembling. She swallowed it slowly, feeling the coolness slide down her throat, hoping for some sense of normalcy to return, even if just for a moment. But it didn't. It couldn't. The figure's words echoed in her mind again. The world is dying. Humanity has failed. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to shut out the voices, the images. It was like a storm swirling within her. Impossible to escape, impossible to ignore. She had been given the truth, but the truth was a cruel burden. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a blessing. It was a heavy weight, one that she couldn't set down. Her eyes snapped open when she heard a knock at the door. "Marie?" A familiar voice called, and she felt her heart rate spike. Her mother's voice, how long had it been since she'd heard it? She didn't respond immediately. Her mind was racing. Was this real? Was this really happening? Or was it another hallucination, a product of the strange place she had found herself in? The door creaked open slowly, and her mother stepped in, her figure warm and comforting, her face full of concern. She looked exactly as Marie remembered her, kind, gentle, loving. The woman who had always been there for her, the one person in the world who had never wavered. But Marie couldn't bring herself to feel the relief she thought she would. Instead, the weight of what she knew now grew even heavier. "Marie," her mother whispered, sitting down beside the bed. "How are you feeling? The doctors said you might be able to leave soon." Marie opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? How could she possibly explain what had happened? How could she tell her mother that the world, the very world they lived in, was on the brink of destruction? That humanity was blind to its own demise, stumbling toward a cliff it couldn't see? Her mother's soft hand rested on hers, and the warmth of it should have been comforting, but instead, it only deepened the sense of isolation. How could she share the knowledge that had been given to her? Who could she trust with such a revelation? "I don't know how to explain it," Marie whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what to say. Everything feels different. The world feels so fragile now. I can't stop thinking about it." Her mother frowned, concern etching deep lines into her face. "What do you mean, Marie? What's going on? You've been through so much. Maybe it's just the shock from everything that's happened." Marie swallowed, but the words felt stuck. She wanted to tell her mother everything. She wanted to scream out the truth, to shake her awake and make her see the reality that was coming. But how could she? How could she convince anyone of something so impossible, so unimaginable? I saw the future," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw what's coming for us. What's coming for the earth." Her mother's face softened, and she leaned in closer, her hand tightening around Marie's. "What do you mean? What future? You've been through a lot, I know. Maybe you're just—" "No," Marie interrupted, her voice suddenly gaining strength. "I saw it. The world isn't going to last. Not the way it is. The earth is dying and no one sees it. No one sees what's coming. And it's too late. We're too late." Her mother's expression faltered, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "Marie, you're scaring me. What are you talking about?" Marie felt a pang of guilt. She knew how crazy she must sound, but she couldn't stop herself. The truth burned inside her, aching to get out. She had to say it. She had to warn someone. Anyone. "You don't understand," Marie whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I saw it. The cities, the oceans, the sky. It's all breaking apart. The world is falling apart, and no one is paying attention. It's happening now, and no one sees it. Humanity is too caught up in their own greed, their own wars, their own mistakes. And we're running out of time." Her mother's hand trembled in hers, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she reached out and gently wiped the tears from Marie's face. "Sweetheart, you've been through so much," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "You don't have to carry this alone. Whatever you saw, whatever you're feeling, you don't have to face it by yourself." But Marie knew the truth now. She had to face it. She had no choice. She had seen the future, and it was too late to turn back. There was no one who could save them. No one who could stop what was coming. The weight of the truth was too much, and yet, she couldn't bear to let it go. She was the only one who knew. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, as Marie sat there, her mother's words hanging in the air. Marie's heart ached with the knowledge that she couldn't change the path they were on. The warning had been given to her, but no one would believe her. No one would listen. "I wish I could make you understand," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "But it's already too late." Her mother's face crumbled as she took Marie's hand into both of hers, her eyes filled with sorrow. But there was nothing to say, nothing to do. The truth had already been spoken, and the world would never be the same. Marie's heart was heavy as she sat silently in her hospital room, the muffled sounds of the world outside barely reaching her ears. It was as if everything had become a blur. The chatter of the nurses, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the soft shuffle of footsteps, all of it felt like it belonged to another world. The world she had once known was no longer the same, and she knew, deep within her bones, that she could never return to the way things were. She had been given the truth, and now she carried the weight of it like a shadow, looming over every thought, every breath. Her mother had left a while ago, but the words from their conversation lingered in the air. "You don't have to carry this alone." But how could she explain to her mother, to anyone, the true depth of what she had seen? How could she make them understand that the very earth they stood on was dying, that the future she had glimpsed was a future of collapse and destruction? The idea that she was the only one who had seen the truth, the only one who knew what was to come, seemed like a cruel joke. The world would continue on, oblivious to the darkness that was creeping closer, to the disaster that was already set in motion. She could try to warn them, try to scream the truth until her throat was raw, but it wouldn't matter. They would think she was crazy. They wouldn't believe her. Marie's hands clenched into fists, the muscles in her arms taut with frustration. She had been given this burden, this knowledge, and there was no way to unlearn it. There was no escape. She had been marked, chosen to carry this truth, but what good was it? What was the point if no one would listen? She stood up, her legs still unsteady from the long period of rest, and walked slowly to the window. She gazed out at the city below, the familiar streets, the cars, the people going about their daily lives. They didn't know. They didn't have a clue. And that made everything feel even worse. The sky above was overcast, the clouds heavy and low. The weather reflected her mood perfectly, gloomy, oppressive, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to happen. The world was on the edge of something. She could feel it in her bones, the pull of it, the dread in the air. It was as if everything were suspended in time, teetering between a past that no longer mattered and a future that had already been written. She closed her eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. How could she go on living, knowing what was coming? How could she stand by and watch the world slip into oblivion, unable to stop it, unable to change the course? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She turned, her heart skipping a beat. The nurse entered, smiling softly as she made her way toward the bedside. "How are you feeling today, Marie?" she asked, her voice warm and kind. Marie forced a smile, though it felt strained. "I'm okay," she replied, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't okay. She would never be okay again. The truth had broken something inside her, something fundamental. She had seen the future, and now she could no longer look at the world with the same eyes. Nothing would ever be the same. The nurse sat down next to her, a look of concern crossing her face. "You've been through a lot. The doctors say your recovery is going well, but if you ever need to talk..." "I don't need to talk," Marie cut in quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. She immediately regretted the tone, but she couldn't bring herself to soften it. There was nothing to say. There was no one who could understand, no one who could truly grasp what she had seen, what she had been shown. Not even the nurse, kind as she was, would be able to see past the surface, past the calm exterior that Marie had built for so many years. The nurse looked at her, her face softening with concern. "It's okay, Marie. I know it's been difficult. Just remember, you don't have to face this on your own." Marie closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her emotions. The nurse's words were kind, but they didn't help. No one could help. She was trapped with this knowledge, this prophecy, and there was no way out. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, and for a moment, she felt as though she might collapse under it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice small and shaky. I can't do this." The nurse didn't respond immediately. She just sat there in silence, her hand resting on the bed beside Marie's. After a long pause, she spoke again, this time softer, as though choosing her words carefully. "I know you're carrying something heavy," the nurse said gently. "But whatever you're going through, you don't have to carry it alone. There are people here who care about you." Marie nodded, though the words felt like they belonged to someone else. She wasn't sure who she was anymore, or what she was supposed to do. She had been given this knowledge, this horrifying vision of the future, and there was no guidebook, no instructions on how to navigate it. The future she had seen wasn't just a vision, it was a reality that was already unfolding, a destiny that couldn't be avoided. The pieces of the prophecy were already in motion, and no matter what she did, she couldn't stop it. The nurse stood up, her expression still filled with concern. "I'll leave you to rest for now, but if you ever need to talk, really talk, I'm here." Marie didn't respond, her gaze distant as she watched the nurse leave the room. The door clicked shut behind her, and once again, the silence settled in. She was alone. Alone with the knowledge of the world's fate. Alone with the terrifying burden that had been placed on her shoulders. She could hear the clock ticking in the corner, the minutes slipping by, and with each passing second, the weight of the prophecy grew heavier. She turned back to the window, looking out at the city below. The sky had darkened, and the world outside seemed so peaceful, so unaware. But inside, In her heart, everything was different. The vision she had seen, the collapse of civilization, the destruction of humanity, was now a part of her. And it was too late to escape it. But even as the knowledge threatened to consume her, a small spark of something stirred within her. A question that she hadn't been able to ask before. What if the future could be changed? The question hung in the air, its weight as heavy as the prophecy itself. But it was the first time she had allowed herself to entertain the idea. She didn't know how or when, but the thought of trying to alter the future, of finding a way to shift the course of destiny, felt like a tiny thread of hope buried deep within the darkness. But no matter how she tried to hold on to that thought, she knew the truth. The future was slipping away, and nothing would ever be the same again. Marie sat in her hospital bed, her mind racing, her thoughts tangled in the chaos that had been consuming her for what felt like an eternity. Every fiber of her being screamed for some kind of release, some way to process the enormity of the knowledge she had been given. She could still feel the weight of the prophecy like an invisible hand pressing against her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs, suffocating her. But the hardest part wasn't the weight of the future she had seen, it was the fact that she couldn't change it. She had been shown a glimpse of the inevitable, a vision of Earth's impending collapse, and she couldn't stop it. The realization sank in deeper with every passing moment. She had no power over it. She was just a witness to the end. "Why me?" she whispered aloud, her voice shaky, barely audible. "Why was I chosen for this?" She knew that there was no answer, that there was no way to understand the reasons behind it. But that didn't stop the question from gnawing at her insides, digging deeper with each passing second. Why had she been the one to see this? Why hadn't it been someone else? Someone stronger, someone more capable of bearing the weight of such knowledge? Her body felt heavy as if it, too, had been marked by the vision. The future that she had seen wasn't just some distant event. It was something that was already beginning to unfold, already in motion. The signs were everywhere, she knew that now. The greed, the apathy, the destruction of the environment, it was all part of the same pattern, a pattern that would lead to humanity's downfall. Marie's eyes wandered to the window, the same view she had stared at countless times before the accident. The city below was alive, filled with bustling people, cars, and buildings. It looked so normal, so familiar, yet to her, it felt like a distant dream. How could everything seem so ordinary when the world was on the brink of collapse? How could everyone else go on with their lives, oblivious to the storm that was brewing on the horizon? She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, her body trembling with the cold. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional weight she carried, but it was enough to keep her grounded in the present, to remind her that she was still alive, still here, still a part of this world that she no longer recognized. "Why is it so hard to change?" she murmured to herself. "Why do they just keep going without even noticing what's happening?" The question echoed in her mind, growing louder, more insistent. It was a question she had asked herself 1,000 times since the figure had shown her the future. But now, as she sat alone in this hospital room, she realized something that had been lurking at the back of her mind, something she hadn't allowed herself to confront until now. The truth was she couldn't change the future on her own. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she screamed the warning to the world, she was just one person. She didn't have the power to stop the inevitable. The figure had made that clear. "You are the witness. You are not here to change it, only to see it." But why give her this burden, this vision, if she wasn't supposed to do anything about it? If there was nothing she could do to stop it? Marie's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden opening of the door. A nurse entered, her face kind, but Marie could see the concern in her eyes. She had been in and out of the room throughout the day, checking on Marie's vitals, offering comforting words, but Marie had barely spoken to her. How could she explain what was happening inside her mind? The nurse walked over to Marie's bed, her footsteps light, almost hesitant. "How are you feeling, Marie? Are you doing okay?" Marie didn't answer right away. She couldn't. How could she tell this kind woman that the world, as they both knew it, was on the brink of destruction? That it was all a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode, and no one could see it? How could she share the terrifying truth when no one would believe her? I don't know, Marie finally said, her voice weak and shaky. Everything just feels so off. Like the world isn't the same anymore. The nurse sat down beside her, her expression softening. It's understandable, she said gently. You've been through a lot, Marie. The accident, the recovery. It's all a lot to process. But you're not alone in this, okay? We're here to help. Marie looked at the nurse, her heart aching with the weight of her own isolation. How could she explain that she wasn't just recovering from an accident? That she wasn't just physically injured? No, she was recovering from the truth, recovering from the vision of humanity's future, a future that was already unfolding, a future that no one else seemed to see. I don't know how to handle this, Marie said softly, her eyes filled with tears that she hadn't yet allowed to fall. I don't know what to do with all of this. The nurse placed a hand gently on Marie's arm, her touch warm and comforting. It's okay to feel lost, she said. It's okay to be scared. You've been through something unimaginable, but you don't have to do it alone. You have people who care about you and will help you figure this out. One step at a time. Marie nodded, but the words felt empty. The nurse's kindness was like a balm to her bruised heart, but it didn't erase the truth she carried. She was the only one who knew. She was the only one who had seen the future, and the burden of that knowledge was almost unbearable. I can't change anything, Marie whispered, her voice barely audible. The nurse didn't respond, but her hand remained on Marie's arm, a silent offer of comfort. For a moment, they sat there together, the quiet of the room filling the space between them. Marie wanted to believe that things would be okay, that she could find a way to change the future she had seen, but deep down, she knew it was hopeless. She had been shown the inevitable, and now there was nothing she could do except bear witness. As the nurse stood up and left the room, Marie was left alone once again with her thoughts. Alone with the knowledge that the world was on the brink, and there was no way to stop it. She looked out the window, watching as the world continued on, oblivious to the looming storm. The world seemed so unaware, so unprepared. And she, the one person who had seen the truth, was trapped in the silence, unable to change what was already unfolding. Marie sat on the edge of her hospital bed, the dim light from the window casting long shadows across the room. The sun was setting, but the world outside felt so distant, so far removed from her. It was as though she had been transported to another place entirely, a place where nothing made sense anymore. The truth, the terrible truth that she had been shown, lingered in her mind like an unshakable presence, and it threatened to consume her from the inside out. The prophecy, the future, humanity's impending downfall. It was all too much for her to grasp, too much for her to carry. But there was no escaping it. She had been chosen to see what others couldn't, what they would never understand. But what good was it? What use was knowing the future if she had no way to stop it? If no one would believe her? The thoughts swirled around in her mind, relentless and unyielding. She stood up abruptly, the cold floor beneath her feet a jarring contrast to the disorienting swirl of her thoughts. Her hands trembled at her sides, her mind caught between wanting to scream out, to share the truth, and the crushing realization that no one would listen. Why do I have to be the one to carry this? The thought hit her with a brutal force. She wasn't strong enough for this. She wasn't a leader, wasn't someone capable of changing the course of humanity's fate. She was just one person, one fragile soul in a world of billions. What difference could she possibly make? She walked to the window and gazed outside, her eyes tracing the movement of the cars below, the people walking, the mundane rush of the everyday world. They were all blind. They couldn't see what she had seen. They couldn't feel the tremors in the earth beneath their feet, the darkness that was rising just beyond their comprehension. To them, everything seemed normal, just as it had always been. But she knew. She had seen the cracks, the fractures that were already starting to appear in the foundation of civilization. She had seen the chaos and the destruction. The end was already written, and nothing she did could stop it. But maybe someone else could. The thought was so sudden, so unexpected, that it startled her. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of hope, a tiny spark of possibility. She wasn't the only one who had seen the truth. She wasn't the only one who had felt the weight of the prophecy. There had to be others. There had to be people who understood the gravity of what was happening, who were capable of seeing the world for what it was, and who had the power to make a difference. But how would she find them? How would she know who they were? Marie clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as frustration surged through her. She could feel the weight of the prophecy in every part of her body, her muscles, her bones, her very soul. She had been marked, chosen. For what? By her. Why did she have to carry this knowledge? Why had the future been revealed to her? Why can't they see? She whispered, her voice cracking in the silence of the room. Why can't they understand? She could almost hear the figure's voice again, the weight of his words echoing in her mind. You are the witness. It is your role to see the truth, but you cannot change it. The words were like chains, binding her to a destiny she had no control over. But deep down, there was a small, defiant part of her that refused to believe it. Maybe I can change it. Maybe I can stop it. But how? How could she, just one person, make any difference in a world that was already on the brink?